Hey everybody, thanks for coming back. We'll do our last little video here on the 1920s. And today we're going to focus on racial issues, the 1920s, as well as immigrant issues in the 1920s as well. And so let's talk about the idea of intolerance and prejudice. We obviously talked about the Great Migration before, when a lot of African Americans moved from the South to the North during World War One for those jobs. And as the white workers came back from the war, there was some animosity because of that. And so we saw a lot of violence and prejudice towards African Americans. Also, a lot of segregation in the cities. Usually, this was the idea of voluntary segregation, or based upon kind of where jobs were allowed, where people were allowed to go, and those kind of things. We mentioned before in World War One, our World War One unit, about the Chicago race riot in 1919, where a fight on the beach led to a few days of fighting throughout Chicago's Black Belt, the number of black neighborhoods that were in Chicago, leaving 38 dead and 537 wounded, being one of those examples of how these racial tensions were. Down south, we saw the rise of the KKK. Eventually, it goes to the whole rest of the country as well. KKK being the Ku Klux Klan. At first, which would be in the 1860s, after the Civil War, to cause problems with Reconstruction. These guys ran around trying to stop the Reconstruction movement, but eventually they fell apart after the federal government stepped in and stopped them. It kind of went into this slumber, if you will, for about 30, 40 years until the 1920s. And as they rise back up again, it adds some of the big racial problems in the U.S. So our second KKK, the group that kind of begins in the 1920s, was started by a guy named William Joseph Simmons. He saw a movie called The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation was set in after the Civil War, and it was about the KKK, those kind of things after the Civil War. In fact, a lot of things that Simmons used in his movie, like the white cloaks, the burning crosses, were never in the original Ku Klux Klan that existed after the Civil War. Instead, they came right from the movie. Yes, these things come from a movie, ladies and gentlemen. But Simmons built through anti-Semitism that happened in the world. There was a Jewish man accused of raping a woman, and then what happened was the public group mob got together and lynched that Jewish man, and ended kind of, we see all these things, kind of these emotional issues kind of bubble to the surface about immigrants and race and all that kind of stuff, and we see this group kind of form against those people. And here's some images of the Ku Klux Klan. You kind of see, obviously, with like the white costumes, the pointy hat, all being in secrecy. You weren't supposed to know who was in this group. You have the Grand Wizards here, which are kind of the guys in the red costumes. The group still do exist today, and they were active in Wisconsin. Well, I've seen images. I was trying to find it of the KKK marching down State Street in Madison towards the Capitol, and so it was in this area of the country as well. The belief was very much white supremacy. Okay, it was white Protestant supremacy. It was anti-Semitic first, which is against Jewish people. It was anti-Catholic. Okay, it was anti-immigrant, anti-communist, very, very fundamental Christian, the idea of that direct, belief of the Bible, and very, very moral. Like, there were stories that KKK would go around at the lovers' lanes as these teenagers out there in their parents' cars, necking in the back of the cars, that kind of stuff, and they drag people out of the cars and that kind of stuff. They go to immigrant areas and beat people up. They would go to communist meetings and like beat people up, those kind of things. And so we kind of saw a lot of these things play a role here. In fact, they were part of the the prohibition movement as well, the idea of morality and seeing the country go dry. You saw a little video we watched about prohibition, how the KKK did support women's suffrage, because then they feel that would kind of help with all the other issues that were in there. KKK got huge over the 1920s. Around 1919, starts with 100,000 members. By 1924, there's 4 to 5 million members worldwide, all because of a dude named Ed Clark. Ed Clark was a guy in public relations. He basically set up this big, huge recruiting campaign where people went, all across the country, little towns, and started, setting up their own little sections of the Klan. And so you had this big national organization with a big imperial wizard. You had realms of areas, and you had domains that were ruled by these guys in charge with names like King Kleagles and Grand Goblins. And basically, they went in those little towns and tried to, terrorize the groups they opposed, whether it be Jewish or Catholic or immigrant or communist or race. Things like lynchings, where they would, go and lynch people, especially African Americans accused of doing things wrong. Like we talked about in our unit, the progressive unit, so progressives regarding, lynchings and that kind of stuff in the North in Indiana. That's why that took place. They do rallies, those big rallies where they march down the street in their white robes to kind of show us a sign of power. They blow up buildings, that kind of stuff. They do arson of different things, that kind of thing. And so the KKK really became a big deal in this time. They also were very political in that they were organized with a political party at that time. And so the political party actually organized candidates that were KKK members. And so the KKK was involved in this political party, and they would rally together to help stop Republicans, that kind of stuff. So you looked at the different governments at this time, Texas, Indiana, in the 20s, you actually found KKK members that were within those governments, and they would use their things to rally for certain politicians. Eventually, in 1927, when Al Smith, a Catholic in New York, is the Democratic nominee for president, you finally start seeing the power of the KKK start falling down. All right, enough about them. Let's go to something else. How about Harlem, New York? So Harlem was, including New York, all different boroughs of New York, there was kind of a color line in New York. And in the borough of Harlem, the Harlem neighborhood, was kind of the area of African American settlement. It's actually called the African Realty Company that helped settle people there. A lot of the whites left the area, and it was left unfair renting. So basically people would not rent to certain colors, certain races because of racist ideas, that kind of thing in New York. Kind of created this informal color line. I'm sure you get a map of this. We're in class. You'll see a map of it. Well, a lot of conditions at this time were pretty rough. We started seeing these with the KKK, all stuff happening. We started seeing this Black national movement get started in America. Okay, with the Great Migration, getting away from the South, more African Americans able to move to the North, speak out. We talk about guys like W.E.B. Du Bois, that kind of stuff. Some started getting some political influence in big cities like New York and Chicago and Boston. And started this new movement. This new movement was called Black nationalism. A big focus on African American culture, expression, and African American exclusiveness. Saying it's not bad to be African American. It's not bad to be black. All right, that we should have pride in what we do in our culture and what makes us and what makes them unique. Is what it kind of came down to. And a big part was the NAACP again, the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, with W.E.B. Du Bois right here. We read before about him, and Booker T, that kind of stuff. Sorry, guys. And he used a lot of different things, the legal action. So he was a lawyer trained at Harvard. He used the different Supreme Court cases to get different things overturned, like the idea of the grandfather clause in Oklahoma. Got rid of that. He did anti-lynching campaigns through Congress and the press. And so we start seeing, all these different things happen. They even actually got a Supreme Court justice who was appointed to be on the bench, not approved because of their feelings and opinions on black suffrage. So really, legally, the NAACP got to the legal end, push for equality. There's another guy, though, who had a little different version. This guy named Marcus Garvey. We'll talk about him more in class this week. One of my favorite people this time period. He's a very outspoken man. He was a Jamaican immigrant, brought his group called the United Negro Improvement Association to the U.S. And he basically told African Americans to liberate themselves from whites. He said, get away from these people, do your own thing, let's be our own group, basically. He even said he saw every white person as a Klansman. Band together, work together, those kind of things. He created his own newspaper and published it. He had his own religion even. And a lot of people, really, African Americans, really liked the message he was saying. The government didn't like him so much. He was later on accused of mail fraud in 1925, arrested, and deported by 1927. But he was kind of another voice, kind of this idea of band together, work together, kind of fight to better African American community versus just kind of take what keeps getting put on us all the time. In Harlem, there was a movement called the Harlem Renaissance, and this is kind of a cool idea. Renaissance meaning a new birth. It was a movement for African American writers and musicians and artists. A lot of them were very well educated, to kind of show the African American experience through different forms. Through poetry, through books, through artwork, all that kind of stuff. Even going back to like African heritage, African folklore, and living about as an African American in the white world. And it's kind of that African American view, point of view, that not everybody got to have. And a lot of it is based out of Harlem, New York, hence the term Renaissance. So some of our most famous poets here, I will read a few of these in class. One guy was Claude McKay, another Jamaican immigrant who wrote very military, very strongly, almost kind of a military tempo about racial prejudice and discrimination, ways to kind of get away from those ideas. They use a lot of that tempo, that upbeat tempo, the jazz music, that very strong points of jazz and blues, kind of bring those through. So he was kind of one example of it. We'll talk about his poetry in class. There was a guy named Countee Cullen, who was very, very classical poet, almost like the old poets of the 1800s, and kind of talked about his struggle living in the white world. Other authors like Zora Neale Hurston, who portrayed lives of young unschooled African Americans in the South, how it was like growing up as a young African American in the South. We didn't have any schooling and those kind of things, unable to get ahead in the world. Dorothy West, a woman who talked about being trapped in a world of sexism and racism, all kind of stuff. Jean Toomer wrote a book called Cane that simply showed the simple life in Georgia, stuff that white people in the North had never seen before, never understood before, and it was kind of that African American point of view about what life is really like for them. Langston Hughes, by far the most famous poet of Harlem, and we'll read his stuff in class on Thursday. He wrote about everyday people, everyday things he saw in Harlem in the African American community. He wrote poetry and plays and stories, and a lot of it was racial pride. It was like, it's good to be a black person, is what it came down to being. He was definitely a people's poet, and writing about everything from lynching to the daily stuff he had to deal with. He wrote about everyday kind of things. We'll look at some of his poetry as well. I was thinking, the cities people lived in, they were a big mix of people. We took at the groups that were kind of being, put down this time. Catholics, African Americans, different religion, immigrants. That was the city you looked at. And cities were truly divided by racial and ethnic lines, still like it was in the 1800s. But you also see the movement of the urban movement where people are still moving to the cities from the country. And living in the country isn't the same as it used to be. Because cities had parks, they had amusement parks, organized sports, fun, and cities really became a big deal at this point. We do see some change in immigration though. There's a science, almost like a pseudo-scientific, a fake science that was printed in something called the Passing the Great Race. That basically only Caucasians, white people from a Nordic or North European descent, were superior. And they had all these different weird tests. They would test the skull and the shape of the nose and all kind of stuff to see who was going to be top and bottom. This is where some of Hitler's ideas come from, this very movement. And these ideas are present here in the United States too. Some people thought that immigrants were taking jobs. We had the Red Scare we talked about at the end of World War I, where anarchists with ties to communists, ties to Europe. Here's a quick review about, those ideas. One thing we see happen in the 20s is something called the Quota Act, where the U.S. Worries about foreign immigrants and starts passing laws that only 3% of a nationality can come into the country. They later on lower that to 2%. So basically, we start seeing less and less immigrants allowed to come into the United States. Now, we have to make our rankings down here of who we should let into the country. And so we start seeing less and less immigrants being allowed into the country in different parts of the world. Obviously, we had that Red Scare we talked about before, the quick review about the Bolshevik Rebellion. It led to why they were scared with the bombings, the anarchists, and the stories coming out of the Soviet Union. The Palmer raids, where they tried to Mitchell Palmer tried to sweep through the cities and sweep all the immigrants with these socialist and radical ideas. And later on comes up with Sacco and Vanzetti, the two guys who were arrested for murder, but people thought it was just because they were immigrants and they were anarchists, and the whole idea, where they were then later on executed electric chairs. So, a little quick review, just kind of remember that little quick review about those guys. Last one to talk about here, I've got pictures on here, I totally forgot to put them on here, but the idea of the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation was a group of authors who wrote books about the 1920s as they lived through them. And they wrote about a lot of different topics, especially about the idea of despair, kind of the down. It sounds like all fun and dancing and that kind of stuff, but it's also the materialism and the bad things of the 20s. Okay, the ideas of war that took place in World War I, the ideas of materialism, how it's not that great a thing, and these different authors who wrote about these different ideas. So one would be Ernest Hemingway, very, very famous author. You might read him in 11th grade this year, who wrote about war and about trying to find one's own meaning, that kind of stuff. And he wrote Farewell to Arms, about how war is really just useless. You have F. Scott Fitzgerald, probably my most famous favorite author of this time period. He wrote The Great Gatsby. Get a chance to the Leonardo DiCaprio version, go see it. Not as good as the original, but it's fine. He wrote about materialism. He actually coins the word flappers, coins the jazz age. Sinclair Lewis writes like short stories about materialism, about how people just want to get more and more stuff, that kind of thing. You have John Dos Passos, who writes about the gap between rich and poor. He wrote a book called Manhattan Transfer, about how people survive in the city, how the poor live in the cities. William Faulkner writes about the Southern people, life in the rural South, that people in the North really couldn't see in the post-Civil War, about small towns and that kind of thing. We do see a presidential race in 1928 where Al Smith is a New York Catholic, first Catholic ever run for president, versus Herbert Hoover, who is a farm boy from Iowa. Hoover wins, but really kind of shows the changes in the country, rural versus urban values. How rural values are kind of going down, urban was going up, and Hoover does win in a landslide. He's the guy who sorts lower taxes, very conservative, same as Harding and Coolidge before him. And question, did change happen in the country? You bet it did. People tried to stop it, but change